let's get moving. So this is who I am. Kind of focus on leaders in tech and finance, folks who got promoted for being good at their jobs, but not necessarily good with people. So fortunately or unfortunately, there's a pretty big market for that. So there's a lot to do in that world of coaching and consulting. Here's a look at that handout that I sent you. And we're going to get right into this first step. And going to talk about some data, why it should be meaningful to us, look at some trends, and 3 things that I see are the levers to engagement, leaders, teams, and culture. Here's a look at the biggest part of the research that I'm looking at of what drove this. Kind of a lot of different things. All these resources are free. Some of them are extensive. The ADP and OC Tanner and even the Glassdoor's got several hundred pages of stuff every year that they put out. And I didn't realize until I started looking, I finally had to come to a point where I just said, stop. I have enough to work with for a 1 or 2 hour presentation. I can't do this anymore. So there's more out there. I'm not saying this is an exclusive list, but this is the bulk of what I looked at. I tried to get data and information that was fresh, that had a good scope, some international, but across a lot of different industries too, because I know we have a lot of industries represented just on this call today. And, you know, to have enough impact, I guess, on our audience. I will give you a disclaimer with Predictive Index. I am a certified partner with that company, and that is a profit stream for me. So I'm a little bit bent on that, but I like some of the research that they have. But I just want folks to know that going in. So why do we care? ADP has done some great research and shown us about how higher engagement leads to performance, profits, turnover. My dad sent me this from the Wall Street Journal, and Drucker School of Management did a study over 6 years on almost 700 companies. And they showed us that the 50 biggest gainers and losers, what caused them to be gainers and losers, they were also the biggest gainers and losers in employee engagement and also development, which is kind of cool. So it's not a secret, but it is a secret because a lot of people don't look at this. And as Jen talked about, she used data to kind of help out her team from getting used as a scapegoat for what's going on in the company. So, you know, this is just one example of some things that are out there. Maynard Lee and Associates, they are an international company. They're based in London. They do a lot of work in India and some here as well. They've got really good stats showing about how engagement can help in productivity, profits, growth, customer satisfaction, that kind of thing. So here's one more slide about this. And investing in employee engagement can increase profits by $2,400 per employee per year. And this is from a study at Best Buy. I was contracting for them 10 years ago. So this number is pretty dated, but still it shows a clear tie between what the company is going to put into their employee engagement, whether it's measurement, whether it's programs, hopefully it's measurement no matter what, but also how it actually can increase profits. And they actually tracked it down per employee per year. Looking at customer retention rates and also the importance of feedback. Again, talking about how Jen mentioned how those frontline managers just having conversations with those people in the first 60 days can have a dramatic impact on what the employee experience is. So put on your thinking caps again. And those of you that have had to hire folks, how hard is it to get qualified applicants? How big is that pool? Do you think there's enough people for you to choose from? Boston Consulting Group has some pretty amazing research on that and showing where we are as far as labor shortage versus surplus in 2020. Right now, we've got about a 10%, these are pre-COVID numbers too, by the way. We're showing about a 10% surplus. So there should be about 10% more people looking for work than what you actually need to hire. But if we follow that across to 10 years from now, in the next 10 years, that's going to get over twice as bad. We're going to only have a 4% surplus, which means it's going to be more than twice as hard to find the qualified candidate to fill those roles we have right now as we go forward into this next decade. And if you want to make it easier on yourselves, then the best way to do it is to not lose people, not have to hire so many people. And how do we do that? Well, that's going to be through engagement. But you look through the consultant that presented this information, when I watched it, he's from Germany. And there, if you look at that second line from the top, they're already negative. So they 4% shortage of labor. And you look where they're going to be 10 years from now, 23%. So when I looked through this, I said, okay, what's causing that? What's our root cause? And looking through Pew Research published this, and it kind of shows how the shift in population and millennials finally took over as the largest segment of the workforce. And what's happening is that that segment of millennials is smaller, but still they're the biggest proportion of the workforce. And you see the boomers, silent generation, and Gen Xers like myself are kind of aging out and dropping out of the workforce. Taking care of millennials is important. And what really drives them is culture. To them, culture is more important than the money. It's why they stay and it's why they apply. Think about, maybe you've got somebody in your life, maybe it's a kid or an associate or a niece or nephew. When they're looking for a job, okay, they run across an ad for a job, maybe it's on LinkedIn, maybe it's Indeed. And where's the second place they go, even before they apply? They're going to look on Glassdoor or some other kind of bulletin board that will give them an idea of what it's like to work at that company. Because it's not just the job. They are tied to so much more than just trying to get things done and trying to make the money. It's a really interesting shift in how this generation has come about. So here's something from my undergrad work in the 1980s, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And you've probably seen this before. And for those of you who may not be familiar or haven't looked at it in a long time, the idea being that bottom level, the physiological, you have to have that before you can move up the pyramid. So this is it runs up in order. You can't have the second, third, and fourth, fifth levels until you've got the first one done. And you can't get to belonging or love unless you've got the physiological and safety done. So this has pretty much been the gold standard for what really motivates people. And if you look at my pyramid, I'm going to have to add these two things on here because those two things are extremely important. But getting back to this, in 1970, which happened to be the year that Maslow died, he added a sixth level to this hierarchy of needs. And I had never seen this in any study before until I started doing research for this particular presentation. And it might sound a little woo-woo to you folks of self-transcendence, but caring for others, intrinsic happiness, and here's an extended definition of what this top level, the ultimate level for Maslow's hierarchy. I can't say why this didn't catch on, why it didn't get publicized any more than it has. There's very little research on this, but he did write it. And when I look at how this is taught, how this is defined, going beyond the self, communion, beyond the self through a peak experience, that sings to me about millennials, about how they're tied to their community. They care about the environment. They care about a lot of things more than just themselves. And it's really interesting. I think this is more applicable to us now than it ever has been. So this is my next project. When I finish talking about engagement, I'm going to go start doing some more research on this piece because I think it's important. I want to see what Maslow was thinking. We've got some more predictive index shares with us about how engagement drops with the company's age. The older the company, the longer the organization has been around, the harder it is to keep engagement up. I put Campbell's Soup up here. They do a lot more than just soup. That's a global company. They are 150 years old, and they're stronger than ever. They're going to come up a little bit later in this deck. Something else that we've seen from this research is that if you're using behavioral assessments, it helps you get people into the right jobs. Predictive index, if you look, they eat their own dog food, as my friends in Silicon Valley say. They use their own tools to help place people in the right jobs where they can be passionate and successful. And it shows up, if you look at them on Glassdoor, they're one of the top places to work and one of the lowest turnovers, especially in a technology company. So they also tell us about, how much higher engagement can be if you use assessments and tools like this and actually show the employees what those results are. So talking about leadership, and you folks can read, but here's a list of 10 things. Basically, 9 of the 10 top drivers of turnover from this research comes from the company and senior leadership. And it's funny how we see there's a lot of L&D sprinkled through here. Let's see, opportunity for learning and development. There's another one down there about career growth opportunity. And we talked about communications a couple times today, but it's interesting to see. Number 8 is in red because there was a fair amount of hospitality workers in here. And sometimes it's hard to be excited about peeling potatoes for 8 hours a day. I know we have machines that do a lot of that now, but an example. So it's kind of hard. Senior leaders don't always have the ability to excite people based on the nature of the work, but that's why that one's kind of called out. If you don't take anything else away from our time today together, this red box here about what modern leadership should be doing, could be doing, to me, this is the whole theme. This is why I'm why I'm here this morning. Leaders connecting people to their purpose, accomplishment, and one another, something bigger than themselves. This comes from O.C. Tanner with some extensive research showing about how this can help your employees be a promoter. We're talking about a lot of companies have this, we want to be, the best place to work. We want to be on that list. And having employees rate their experience high actually helps that, and it makes recruiting easier. More things that if we're engaging this kind of leadership model will help us with engagement, positive perception, and less burnout. Burnout's a real big thing today as we're going into more remote meetings and being turned on all the time in our home offices. It can be a real challenge for us to avoid getting burned out. So almost a year ago, I had the privilege of flying out to the USS Nimitz, the aircraft carrier. They were about 100 miles off the coast of San Diego. I was out there with a group of business folks, and we got to spend 2 days and 1 night on the aircraft carrier. And it was unbelievable watching. They didn't have the full crew on board. What they were doing, their mission at that time, pilots were flying in from San Diego to get qualified and requalified on landing on the aircraft carrier. So they were running as many takeoffs and landings, which they're recoveries is what the landing is called, and launch for takeoff. But they were doing that pretty much 24 hours a day, getting as many pilots practice as they possibly could. But we got the run of the whole ship. We got to talk with all kinds of folks. We sat down and had meals with several different groups throughout that time. And it was kind of amazing to watch. This is me in the captain's chair talking to the captain. And, you know, I said, okay, when you're out at sea, you're going to have 4,500 people on this boat. You have about 3,000 right now, which is amazing in itself. And I asked him, what's the average age of the person on this? He goes, well, for enlisted people, non-officers, it's about 19 years old. So think about what if you had 3,000, or when they're at sea, 4,500 19-year-olds on a very small piece of real estate, and you've got to keep them all motivated and engaged. And, you know, as we walked through the ship on this couple of days, we saw things in this slide on the top left. That's actually a girder from the World Trade Center, kind of showing why are we out here? What's one of the reasons we do what we do? When you've got these sailors that are out there for 6 months at a time, hopefully it's only 6 months, you know, what keeps them going every day? What keeps them from calling in sick? You know, on the right-hand side of the slide is burial at sea. We saw about 20 or 30 service members, you know, from that were buried that day, and the kind of respect and decorum and process that goes through that is just amazing to watch. So I asked the captain, how do you keep these folks engaged? And he told me it's pretty simple. He says millennials kind of get a bad reputation for how they behave, that they're selfish, you know, and his experience has been if you get them aligned on something bigger than themselves and celebrate accomplishments, then that's pretty much what it comes down to. So he told me basically in a nutshell, it's connecting their people to purpose and accomplishment and each other. And that was evident on the ship. 3 times a day, they blow the whistle, and anybody that is working that can stop for a short break takes a break. So all activity stops on the ship, and they give announcements. And those announcements cover all of these things. They talk about an accomplishment. You know, they told us how many recoveries and launches they took on that day, how many airplanes actually got to take off from the ship, which is a huge number. They also talked about what the purpose of that was, how keeping these pilots current and ready makes us ready for warfare and keeping our country safe. It was just really amazing. All 3 of those announcements, including the one right before lights out, before everybody goes to bed, except the folks that get to work all night. It's amazing. Each one of those announcements had all of these elements in it every day, 3 times a day. That's one of the ways that they keep their people engaged. Measurement is really important. And, you know, thanks to Jen even for bringing that up early on in the conversation. And, you know, I want to keep on moving about this, but when we go from leadership to teams, autonomy is a big deal. And this is some interesting stats that come to us that show how autonomy, giving folks without micromanaging and giving a team a good way to work together can have a huge impact on their output. Another piece, if we're using behavioral assessments to drive teamwork and better communications, whether, you know, some folks are really hung up on they use DISC as their tool, or they have Myers-Briggs, whatever, if you've got something in your organization that you have a common language, being able to use that can actually drive better teamwork. And mainly, I kind of like just the 4 things they talk about of what's important for engagement for a team from their standpoint, and value involved. And there's that developed word again. Our workforce really wants to know that we care enough about them to invest in them. Cross-functional teams, you got to love them. Whether you come from a matrixed organization, or you're going to have this dotted line reporting relationship, and there's a lot of that coming. We've shown that it's probably one of the best ways to get more productivity out of a team, and a lot of organizations set up cross-functional teams. What I feel like happens is that we know it's a good idea, we set up the team, and then we forget about it and don't really help that team be set up and ready to function at its highest. Stanford tells us that 3/4 of these teams are dysfunctional, and that should not be a surprise to us. When we look at Atlassian, they own the tools Jira, Confluence, Trello, and probably something else by now, but it's a lot of teamwork, ticketing systems, work organization systems. Their research tells us that 90% of the work worldwide is complex and needs teams. And then Marcus Buckingham, who sold StrengthsFinders to ADP, also runs the Gallup organization, does a lot of polling, a lot of data. There's some of his data, in this presentation. He tells us that HR should not be forming these teams, these cross-functional teams, because they can't see what's going on. They don't know who's really best and how these folks are acting together. And if they do put the teams together, they're unable to see how effective they are going forward. So what HR can do, or talent development, is use some other tools to do some research. Maybe it's Jira through ticketing, or Slack through instant messaging, and find out where these hubs of activity are, who are the leaders, and how can you put the best team together that can actually have the best output, and just giving your leaders some rope where they can measure their own output. And of course, communications is a big deal. Here's a picture. When I was at Zappos, we were fortunate to have a team of software engineers that built stuff just for performance management and talent development. And what you're seeing on the left is just a small piece of this graph of about 4,000 employees at the time, that the bigger that each one of these nodes are, the more connections they have, the more different people they interact with via email. This is strictly from Outlook data. And each color represents a different business unit. So from this, and when it was in real time, it was kind of spooky to watch, because this thing would move in real time and expand and contract, and these things would move around. It was kind of spooky, but we could actually hover over one of these circles and see who it was and understand who the connectors are, who the people are that actually have touched different parts of the business, and how much impact or influence do they have across the company. So there are a lot of different things out there. You can probably buy something like this off the shelf if you want to now. What else can we do? As we're talking about teams and to see why people are leaving. I heard Jen mention exit interviews, and we don't have time to do those. And that doesn't break my heart, because exit interviews are usually just full of fluff and lies, because people don't want to burn the bridge on their way out. And as Zappos, we felt like we had a problem with turnover. We formed a task force and said, okay, here's what the exit interview said. Now we're going to find out why they really left. We talked to their supervisor, we talked to their peers, and we'd have that. So we had the actual reason that they left, not just what they tell HR on the way out the door. That was really changed the way we looked at things. And also, when we thought our turnover was high, similar to what Jen talked about, we did research and found out that our turnover was no higher than some of our competing employers, which at the time were Google and Facebook. Once we got to the same level of turnover for certain workforce groups as those two competitors that were hiring our people away, we didn't waste too much more time of trying to get better. How can I be better at retaining people than Google? It's probably not going to happen. So, as Jen touched on early in this conversation, having some data on your industry is really important. Employee experience management. We talk about customer experience often. How our employees are experiencing things is even more important, I think. And this shows that 1 in 5 of these millennials, mostly millennials, left their job because the experience was bad. It might be communication, it might be lack of feedback. There are a lot of things that can drive that. And if you're not concerned about it, not looking at it and measuring it, then it's going to be hard for you to have an impact on that. A little bit about culture. O.C. Tanner, I like their model of what they see as a thriving culture, showing the kind of different things on there and the different experiences that come in between combining some of these things together. And, employee satisfaction obviously goes way up with a good culture that's thriving. Good cultures that they're telling us better net promoters as far as employees that want to brag about the place that they work, more likely to get great work, 13 times more likely to have highly engaged employees with a decent culture. That to me is important. So it is worth us taking a look at what can we do with ourselves, with our organizations to make them better that way. Half of the employees are satisfied with annual surveys. Can you get meaningful data if you're only asking once a year? And thinking about other feedback channels, this is a picture from, I think that's Raymond James in Florida, but they would do Wednesday wall sits. So every Wednesday after lunch, maybe about 2 o'clock, it's the middle of the week, people are tired, you're back from lunch, and maybe you're kind of starting to drift down a little bit energy-wise. They'd send something out on the instant messaging. They use Slack at this facility and say, okay, that's it, Wednesday wall sits, 3rd floor, let's go. And they would show up, and if it's ladies with high heels, of course, they kick their shoes off, and they play some terrible disco song for about 3.5 minutes, and everybody would do the Wednesday wall sits, everybody that could. This doesn't cost anything, and it's an amazing barometer of what the culture is like in that organization. So here you see what you got, about 10 people in this picture here. What if next Wednesday only 3 people show up? Something's going on. Is it something in the environment? Is it something that leadership could control? Is it, was everybody out sick that day? But things like this don't cost you anything, and you can monitor the levels of participation and get a feel for what's going on with the culture of the company at the same time. So you don't always have to invest in giant expensive tools. I put this list on here. We're talking about how else can we figure out, are employees happy? Are they satisfied? Are they engaged? And the biggest thing I want to point to is that the very bottom, the least valuable part of making employees feel, like they're engaged and like they're having an impact is the one-to-one meetings, which is their boss. And as you go up that list to which one has more impact on the employee experience, you can see it's going into the larger groups, to that sense of community, to something outside of themselves. I'm not saying the one-to-one is not important, but it's very interesting to see how it looks like twice as much value is on more of the group activities, and what is the group telling this individual employee and that impact on their experience. That really kind of struck me. When we're asking for feedback from our organization, I can't tell you how critical it is to take action on that and do it quickly. If we're able to take action on this, like an engagement survey, for instance, within 90 days, employees will feel more heard, they will trust the organization. Unfortunately, it says half the organizations take longer than 6 months, and just over half actually even address it. And I worked with a company at one time, and they would do these yearly engagement surveys, and they would hound people to take it because people weren't really excited about it. They, after beating people up through emails over a month or so, they finally got what they felt was a statistical, decent amount of this, and then they'd stop. But then they would publish the results. They were public and very transparent about that, but they never did anything about those results. They asked the employees for their opinions. The employees told them what they thought, and as an organization, they failed to even act on it. Their only recognition was, oh yeah, here's what you said, and they moved on. Eventually, after a couple of years, I pleaded with them to stop sending this survey out if you're not going to do anything with it, and they actually stopped, which was great. That's not the best outcome. The best thing would have been for them to actually act on it, but I got to accomplish what I could. So if you're going to start measuring engagement, if you Google it, what is this, 133 million results? It's important that we measure what we're looking at, but what I would urge you to do is not to wing it. When I used to work with the CPLP group and work on test questions, working on validating the rubric and that sort of thing, if you've ever worked with a psychometrician, there is so much that goes into designing a good test question, a good survey question. And there's a lot of testing that has to be done to make sure it doesn't discriminate and that the language is right. There's so much involved. So I would urge you, if you're going to use a survey, to not make your own, because the results that come back from that, if you haven't validated the survey, may not be telling you what you think it's telling you. There are a lot of companies out there, these are the ones that I happen to have experience with. I know there are plenty more, but what I would urge you to do is, if you want to measure this, look around for something that's, got the right amount of impact that you're looking for, and also the right amount of employee impact, meaning, Matrix Insights comes to mind. I've done some work with them, and I really they've got a great barometer survey that you can send out just to an individual team, and you can send it out weekly or monthly. It takes about 2 minutes, less than 2 minutes to do. And it basically, they ask about 10 different categories. You drag a slider from 0 to 10 and how you're feeling about that at the time. If you want to put a sentence in at the end, you can, you don't have to, done. And if you're able to get that, and as we showed on the previous couple of slides, act on that information, show the team, hey, I got this information. I want to dig in and find out how we can make it better. That's one way to do it. Team vital signs, spoiler alert, I am certified in this tool, but I use this to illustrate there are tools that can get you an actual number for a team or an organization on things like motivation, on trust, on change and teamwork. And also you look at the outcomes on the right side of the screen on satisfaction. How agile are we? And the bottom left is something I wanted to think about, especially in a change management or engagement situation. You see that's the big part of that group and engagement is neutral. That's not a bad thing. You know, if you get folks that are disengaged, that's one thing. And you may not be able to get a disengaged team member from disengaged all the way to engaged. But if you can move them into that neutral zone where they're not actively working against you and your organization, that can have a huge difference on the overall employee experience. So you're not always going to get somebody to go from the silver pie shape to the blue, but if you can get them into neutral, that's still a win. So that's something to be aware of. ProSci is one model, one organization that does training on change management. Like everything, there are a lot of different tools out there. This is the one I use and I'm trained in and I love it. And, you know, I talked about Campbell's and how Campbell's Soup Company as a global concern has lasted 150 years. I got to meet their chief learning officer in California a couple of years ago. And he told me that all 450 of their middle managers from, I think, New Jersey is where they're based. All 450 of these managers have to go through the 3 or 4 day ProSci change management training. How do they keep their folks engaged and able to accomplish change? Because about 70% of organizational change fails across the world, really, which is terrible. You put new things in place, people aren't along with you, and it causes problems. So this is something that I see that Campbell Soup kind of does right, in my opinion. Communication, one-to-ones are very important. We talk about how that can add an engagement. There are a lot of ways to do them, and I would encourage you to look around and look for some best practices and things that work for other organizations. You know, when we really dug in at Zappos and we found out that one-to-ones were almost twice as effective if you let the team member or the employee pick the time and day to have that instead of just the manager getting to just fill their calendar. That's something I never thought of until that. I've been doing one-to-ones for years. And then when we saw that, I was amazed at how big a difference just something small like that could make. So again, here's our tagline for today: connecting people, purpose, accomplishment, and one another. I think if you can get this done, or just think about it and think about what changes you can make, what tweaks can you make to the way that your leaders are doing their jobs, it can have a huge impact on the organization. And, you know, wrapping up, talking about measurement and things like that, super important. So, and Alexei, I hope this is okay to share with the group. Talks about what thoughts we have on what I'm seeing with clients in terms of their interest talking about engagement. There's a talent surplus due to the recession. It's important we keep organizational leaders focused on why this matters. Engagement is not an easy sell, I feel like sometimes. And some leaders will bunch it into what they call soft skills, which some leaders don't want to hear about, some companies don't want to hear about. And my experience focusing on the tech sector, which is not really having a recession right now because they're used to working in remote teams and they haven't had the same kind of experience that our folks down on the strip here in Las Vegas have had as far as not, losing so many jobs or being furloughed and laid off. So I'm going to say I'm pretty blessed, but I know that sometimes when you're trying to sell engagement to senior leadership, don't focus on the word engagement. I talked in one of the breakout groups about how important language can be and point to some of the benefits. Point to, if you do an engagement survey and you measure it and make a difference in engagement, here's the effect it has on turnover. What does turnover cost us as an organization? And SHRM has some really good calculators. I used to have one on my website, and a decent salaried position, it can be 2 or 2.5 times the annual salary is what turnover in one of those key positions costs you. And if you can say how much money we're going to save, just take one group, maybe it's middle managers, and how much can we save if we bring turnover down by 5% in this one group? How much is that going to save us on the bottom line on relocation, onboarding costs, training, loss of productivity while you're getting this new employee up to speed, all those things. So if you can show them engagement is a tool or a lever to improve some other KPIs that the company is concerned about. So maybe I'm answering your question in a different way here. You're trying to sell it, find out what's important. What are the hot buttons for that leader? What do they want to see change? And I guess that's probably what a good consultant does, of just asking a lot of questions first and trying to figure out what's important to this person you're talking to, and then figure out how the stuff you're selling, engagement, even as an internal employee, can solve that problem and take the thorn out of their paw. But so that's probably one of the easiest ways, or an effective way. And it comes down to using the data. Show them research and take some of this stuff, and maybe some of it's already dated that I shared in the chat box, and go out and find some newer stuff. Find something that helps you make your point to the audience. But a lot of it is stakeholder management and really understanding what is important to the leaders, the budget holders, whomever that might be, and use it to your advantage. Thank you for asking.